Hi everyone! Ness here, back again to talk about human rights. This week I'll be talking about the right to live and receive support in the community, or the right to not live in an institution. Before I get started, I do want to give a quick content warning, as I'm going to briefly describe some of what it's like to live in an institution, which may be triggering or otherwise upsetting for some folks to hear. This right to live and receive services in the community or to not live in an institution is really connected historically to the formal self advocacy movement of folks with disabilities coming together to advocate for rights and create change. The right to not live in an institution is protected by federal and state laws that came about due to advocacy efforts by people with disabilities speaking out against institutions. The self advocacy movement actually really started worldwide as a push by people with disabilities to have institutions be closed while getting necessary help for personal care, activities of daily living, transportation, and other needs. So, when we talk about institutions, we're talking about large, hospital like places where people who have disabilities live long term. I do want to say that institutionalization of people who experience mental health challenges or who have extreme emotional or mental states is also a human rights issue, but that I'm going to focus specifically on institutions for folks who are developmentally disabled. Institutions are bad for a lot of reasons. Institutions are segregated, meaning they're intended to keep people with disabilities separate from people who don't have disabilities, and are most often also isolated, meaning they're not close to town centers or community resources. They're places where people don't have freedom to move around how they want or come and go. There have historically been places where people received very little education or poor quality education, places where there's been a ton of abuse, and also places where people don't have much choice and usually have to stick to a strict schedule decided on and enforced by staff rather than decided on based on the needs and preferences of folks who live and get services there. So, in the United States, the closing of institutions for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities started in some states in the 1970s, but I believe there was no federal law that affected the whole country that was about closing institutions and helping disabled folks move out of institutions and get support in their communities until the Supreme Court decision Olmstead versus Elsi, which happened in 1999. So that's really recent. In this case, two women, Lois Curtis and Elaine Wilson, sued Tommy Olmstead, who was the commissioner of the Georgia Department of Human Resources. What they said in their lawsuit was that being held in a segregated institution was a form of discrimination that should be illegal under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And this case went all the way to the Supreme Court, which means that the decision the court made affected the whole country. So the Supreme Court ruled in their favor and said that people with disabilities have a right to live and receive state funded support in the community instead of in an institution, as long as the medical professionals in their life think that community based services would be appropriate, as long as the person wants community based services, and as long as the state could reasonably provide those services. It's that third part that states have been able to use to delay closing institutions and moving people into services that are not segregated. The Supreme Court said that states needed to have a plan for the creation of community based supports and that states needed to show that people who are on waiting lists to be moved out of institutions were being moved off those waiting lists and into community based accommodations at a reasonable pace. So they didn't say that institutions had to be closed as quickly as possible, just that states had to show that they were making progress on moving people out of institutions. Because of this, some states actually still, today, in 2020, have folks with disabilities living in institutions, even though the Supreme Court said that institutions, because they're segregated, count as illegal discrimination under the ADA. These states may not technically be violating the law as long as they're able to show that they're making progress. even if they are violating individual people's rights. So I want to be really clear in saying that institutionalization is not a historical problem or a thing of the past. It is a current problem. It's happening right now. There are still people with disabilities living in institutions today. So that's one big problem with how deinstitutionalization has been going. It's been slow. It's a process that's taken over 20 years so far and is still not finished. But I also want to talk about another problem that self advocates have pointed out about how deinstitutionalization has been working out in the United States. Instead of institutions, now a lot of folks with intellectual disabilities live and get support in group homes. And self advocates around the US have pointed out that some of the problems with institutions have continued to be problems in some group homes and have continued to be problems in the way some services are provided in general. So, some of the problems that still happen in some group homes that make them feel just like smaller institutions um, include that there can be really strict rules and schedules that are determined by staff and not based on the needs or preferences of folks living in the homes. There can be a lack of choice and a lack of self determination in some of our services, even though we claim to really support the value of self determination. A lot of services in the field of developmental disabilities are making efforts to uphold that value of self determination, but I don't think that everywhere it's being fully achieved. Um, and in group homes, there's often still an increased vulnerability to abuse, the way that there has been in institutions. Just because a group home is located in a neighborhood with other people and other houses where folks live doesn't mean that folks who live in the group home are really supported to be a part of the community that they live in and to use the resources that exist in that community. So segregation and isolation can still be an issue. So just to wrap up, folks with disabilities have a right to not live in an institution and to not face segregation. And the United States still has work to do when it comes to protecting those rights and enforcing laws that protect those rights. I'm going to drop a link to a website that has a list of resources that may be able to help you if you feel like your rights in these areas are being violated. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you have any questions or just want to let me know what you think of this video, please comment or message this page. You can also reach out to us just to say hi or if you need support. We'd love to hear from you. I'll be back next week. Bye!